Hi, everyone. We are fortunate enough to have Nicole Collins with us this evening. She is the Director of Clinical Services at Pediatric.
Hi, thank you. So as Alita said, my name is Nicole Collins, and I am a clinical director. So I am an OT by trade, and I oversee the clinical services. I'm here to talk to you tonight about occupational and physical therapy services in the schools, and also with a special focus on some sensory. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, let's. Okay, so since I can't hear or see anybody, hopefully I'm sharing and you can see everything okay. I'm going to present. There we go. Okay. All right. So at PTS, we not only staff with occupational and physical therapists, but we also do some programming. And so I have a background in occupational therapy. As I said, I'm also board certified in pediatrics. I am certified in the sensory integration and praxis tests. And I'm also recently certified in the new sensory integration test, which is called the EASY through the AIRS sensory integration. I can't remember. It's CLASSY. So it's like the collaboration for leadership in AIRS sensory integration. Okay. So we're going to start with talking about occupational therapy services in the school. And so the regulation of OT happens from a couple different sources. The American Occupational Therapy Association, where we have our practice guidelines. Also the National Board Certification in Occupational Therapy. So if you ever see the letters after an OT's name, it's R/L because we are registered and we're licensed per state. We also just got new practice guidelines from the Pennsylvania Occupational Therapy Association. At this point, only members of the association have been able to get the guidelines, but they are going to be coming out and available for administrators and schools in the spring, which is really exciting. This is the first time when they just did their most recent licensure. And then there's a couple different laws that oversee occupational and physical therapy services. And this is the same for both of them: the Rehabilitation Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, and the Every Student Succeeds Act. We're going to talk about what that really means a little bit later. Physical Therapy Association that also has their own practice guidelines. The National Physical Therapy exam that they need to pass in order to practice. In Pennsylvania, we have a PA chapter of the APTA who, in collaboration with AOTA, came up with the new practice guidelines. They also have state-specific licensure, and they're also overseen by the same acts that are guide occupational therapy services. So in schools, just a really quick overview. Students are referred for OT or PT services, generally by teachers. We also have small group supports, which is called Tier 2 programming. And then Tier 3 is evaluation or more student-specific services that we would provide. MTSS also supports students who require occupational or physical therapy services, but they do not have a documented disability. And so when a student doesn't have a disability but still has those needs, the Every Student Succeeds Act actually broadened our ability most recently in the most recent update to be able to help those students regardless of whether or not they have a documented disability. And so MTSS really helps to provide those services more across the spectrum in terms of what we can do for students, both in the classroom who are in regular education, as well as students who may be found eligible for special education services later on. If we move to an evaluation and students are eligible for school-based services through special education, then we are able to provide those services either through a 504 service agreement, which is based on the Rehabilitation Act, or through an individualized education plan. And so the difference for occupational and physical therapy in terms of the how we would work on an IEP versus a 504. Because occupational and physical therapy are considered secondary services in a school, we really support academics. So we are not directly working in an academic area. We are really focusing on foundational skills that students need to succeed in an educational setting. Because we're a secondary service, we're not able to stand alone on an IEP. So for that reason, the student has to have some other type of disability. So that could be a specific learning disability, other health impairment, speech and language, and then we're able to be a related service on there. If the student doesn't have a disability, does have a disability, but they don't qualify for an IEP and maybe just need some accommodations, we are also able to go on to a 504. And that third option that we already talked about is staying through the MTSS process. So in schools, the areas that we mostly addressed for OT is play and leisure, making students can access everything that they need to. We support the academic areas. We support social participation. Excuse me. We also support their self-care skills in order to be successful in their lives, both in the educational realm, as well as once they graduate and transition. We work on specific work skills or vocational training, and then we also work on those transition skills that those students need in order to be successful in no matter what the setting is that they go into once they leave the educational setting. Like I said before, occupational and physical therapists really work on foundation. And so I wanted to just briefly go over what are those foundational areas or those underlying areas that occupational therapists address in a school setting. So the areas that we look at that can support academic success is fine motor control, visual motor integration, visual perceptual skills. And so these are three, I don't want to say basic, but these are really big areas that most students would get evaluated for if they're looking, if occupational therapy is looking to see if there's difficulties. Axis skills, which is motor planning or motor coordination, how well a student is able to organize their bodies, organize their thoughts, put things in a logical string. Executive functioning, we overlap a little bit with this area with our psychologists. And the reason that we look at executive functioning as occupational therapists is that it is directly related to that sensory processing and praxis area. Oftentimes students who are younger, who have sensory processing difficulties, as they get older and we start to see middle school, high school timeframes, we start to see some more of executive functioning difficulties that really stemmed from or related to the sensory processing. If you think about when students are younger and have difficulty with sensory processing, so they and then have appropriate responses. When you're younger, you see this in the body. As we get older, it really moves into more abstract areas of organization, sequencing. And so that's really where those executive functioning difficulties are highlighted as those students age. And the last piece that we really look at is social emotional processing. And this is highly tied to both the sensory as well as skill deficits. I'm sure many of you can relate that when something's difficult for you, there's an emotional component to that. We could play games with ourselves in our minds of, oh, I just don't want to do this, or this is too hard. And as adults, we do this. So we can think that when our children are having difficulties in any of these areas and they really need to work harder on some of these skills, it can have an emotional impact as well as affecting their social participation. So in the area of physical therapy, some of the areas that would be addressed in physical therapy would be balance skills, both seated, standing, 1-foot balance, transfer skills, walking through the cafeteria safely, playing on the playground. Are they able to access the bus, the stairs safely? Also, those gross motor skills, which is mostly what we think about when we think of physical therapy. But are they able to access that more in an education setting in terms of what play is expected, recess time, as well as physical education? As the students age, again, we're looking at our students who might be in some type of program. What is their community independence? Are they able to access public transportation? The different areas that these students might need as they transition out of their educational setting. And then finally, safety awareness and fall or injury prevention. Depending on what the needs are of the students, physical therapists are really good at taking a look at these issues throughout the student's day and really making sure that they're safe in what they're being asked to do in their educational setting. And the underlying areas that really drive those pieces that physical therapists look at are muscle strength, their endurance, their range of motion, which is are they able to move fully through what we call like an arc with their upper body. Get plan their body movements in order to reach a goal. So, can they figure out how to move their body to kick the ball into the net? Can they figure out how to move their body to throw a ball at a target? And so they're really organizing their movement for a targeted goal or a targeted skill. Okay, so what is the difference between school-based OT/PT and outside services? This is always a really big question. And really the answer to that is the focus. What are we looking at when we're looking at the student, and what is the goal that we're looking to achieve with the student? Okay, so in a school-based setting, the session is, or the intervention is going to directly relate to the student's ability to perform the school-related task. So we're looking at, are they able to access what they need to do throughout their day? It follows legislative guidelines on specifically school academics. And so those acts that I mentioned in the beginning are really the ones that guide our practice in school-based settings. This was painful for me because, as we're going to go talk about in a moment, really when you're an outpatient, you can really look at a student or a child and really have a much broader sense of what you can work on because it really is going to impact so many additional areas at home and in the community. So this was something that I really had to, focus on and kind of swallow as I moved from an outpatient setting into the school-based setting. And so in outpatient, you really can focus on any identified area of need. And so, parents are usually the ones that are coming to you with their concerns, and you really have much more leeway in what you're able to focus on. It addresses all areas of life. So home, also in school and collaborating with school therapies or, school teachers, as well as community settings to a greater extent. And it has a broad focus of function. And so parents will say to me, well, my child has a diagnosis. Doesn't that automatically qualify them for sort of those present in order for us to legally, ethically be able to qualify students for services? So we're going to talk now more specifically into sensory, and I'm going to tell you that this is my passion. This is my area that I absolutely love. I've done much intervention both in school-based settings, creating programs, creating sensory rooms. I have presented all over the world for sensory. I was in Bulgaria. I did a Panama presentation. So I had a really great practice that I was associated with, and I was really able to immerse myself in sensory. What I love right now in my role is really bridging all of the information that I know and that I was able to put into practice in more of that outpatient clinic setting. And how does that relate to school, and how can we support our students in the classroom that have sensory needs? To start with, when we talk about So I don't want to get too technical, but I also want to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. So sensory processing is really just an umbrella term, and it really is the way that information moves through the central nervous system from the receptors in our hands, our feet, our mouth, our vestibular or our movement, and how that goes throughout the body and the brain. When we talk about sensory registration, this is a really important part to sensory integration. It's how that central nervous system notices or detects input. And so when we talk about registration, if a nervous system is functioning effectively, there's all these different inputs that are coming into us, even right now while you're sitting and listening to me. There is input from the lights around you, from activity that's happening in your environment, the sounds that you hear in your environment, the feeling of your body sitting on the chair or the couch that you're on, the feeling of the clothes on your body. These are things that we don't think about all of the time, but those are all of the pieces, and only some of them, that are impacting our body and our nervous system right now. And then our ability to take in all of that information, process it, and now be able to differentiate, what do I need to be able to listen to this presentation, where that they're happening. And if something were to make an electrical sound, I might pay attention to it because that might be something that I need to pay better attention to. But oftentimes we're able to put those things in the background and focus on what we need to. Students that have difficulty with registration, they're not able to do this. So another important part when we talk about sensory integration is that we talk about the sensations based on where they come from. And so senses that come from outside of the body, the term that we use is exteroception. And those senses are our visual input, which is any input to the eyes, including light, auditory input, which is sounds that we have to our ears, olfactory, which is smell. I have taste in there, which is incorrect. Sorry. My goodness. Olfactory is our smell. Oral is our taste and input to the mouth. And then we have our tactile input. And tactile has multiple layers. Cellular, which is how my head is moving through space from our muscles and our joints. So it's the position of the joints, the position of the muscles, how much movement I have in my muscles as I'm doing something. And then also goes into areas such as force of the muscles. And then the last area that is not newer in OT world, but definitely a newer area that many people are talking about much more today in sensory integration world is interoception. And this is the idea of the input that we're getting from all inside of our body. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but it's really the fascia, which is the covering around all of our internal organs, as well as our, I feel sick, my stomach hurts, those types of things, or the affective emotions. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm nervous, I'm scared. And so interoception, as we're finding, has a really, really big impact on sensory processing, and especially when we talk about that link that it has for our social emotional processing. Some more definitions that I want to talk about is that when we talk about the way information is processed for sensory information, it's processed in two very different ways. And so this is really important when we talk about sensory integration. Oftentimes, people will look at something like the sensory profile or the sensory processing measure, which are questionnaires. And what they'll see is, this student is over or underreactive, or, responds more. And that is the idea of what encompasses sensory. And that's really only one specific part of sensory. When we look at sensory and that whole umbrella of what falls under there, there's much more. So the one that I just described, or the response to the intensity of the input, or sensory reactivity, okay? It's our arousal level. It's over or under responsive we are, or it could be mixed in certain systems. And that might mean that one system might be over responsive, so I might be very sensitive to touch and to sounds in my environment, but I might be under responsive to proprioception and vestibular and really need a lot more movement during the day in order to get my body to an organized place. It can also mean something like I'm very sensitive to tactile, but if you start to give me some tactile input very quickly, I'm over responsive to it. And so that really boils down to the way that those receptors in those systems are responding to the input that we're giving them. And it's a really tricky consideration when we look at sensory diets. And we're also going to go into that. When we talk about sensory modulation or reactivity, we're really looking at what we call the reticular activating system and the limbic system, which are centers for our emotional control. And then also our autonomic nervous system, which is that fight or flight response. And any of you who have children with sensory modulation difficulties know that fight or flight is really where those kids live most of the time. They are really going very primitive, protective, interpret the inputs, or how we perceive the meaning of the input. So it's really how we use the different systems functionally. So if we think about tactile input, we think about whether we're over or under responsive when we look at modulation. And so maybe I'm very over responsive, and so tags in my shirt will bother me. I don't like getting my hands messy. But when we look at sensory discrimination, how am I able to use the tactile system to know how I'm holding my pencil, or where exactly to hold the pencil while I'm erasing? Or how do I use what we call stereognosis? Can I reach into my bag and pull out a pen without looking at it? So it's really taking that same system, looking at it both from a modulation perspective and discrimination perspective. And we're going to talk about this more as we go through. So if you look at the brain areas involved in discrimination, we're looking at brainstem, thalamus, cerebellum, cortex. This may not mean much to you, but I think the important part information, each of those little buttons is a different sensory system. And that little slider is whether I'm over or under responsive to each in particular system. So am I over or under responsive to vestibular, or am I over or under responsive to tactile? But also you have those buttons at the top. So now those are my discriminators. Am I able to use these systems to discriminate what I need to in order to use these sensory systems most efficiently? So one of the big behaviors that we see in terms of what the students are demonstrating in a classroom when they're having difficulty with sensory processing. So when we don't process sensory input efficiently, so we take the information in, but our body reads the signals different than maybe somebody else would. They read it as dangerous. And maybe that's because somebody brushed past them and they're over responsive to tactile. Maybe that's because somebody behind them laughed very suddenly and it startled them because their auditory system's over response. But really primitive place. And so that's where that fight comes in. And then we have those kiddos who really just shut down or freeze, and that's the fright stage. And so our nervous systems respond to stress in different ways. And so you may see any or all of those happen when those students have a response. So again, reminding ourselves that this is really our primitive system and it's trying to protect us. It's telling us you're in danger, protect yourself. So when the system is triggered, we really lose our connection to our prefrontal cortex that houses logic and reasoning. If any of you are not familiar with Dan Siegel and his flipping your lid analogy, I do encourage you to go on and look at that. It really does help to demonstrate how we respond to sensory information in our environment. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and let me just see here. Come back to you. So hopefully you can see me on this screen now. But I wanted to show you the hand model, the way that Dan Siegel actually goes over it. So what we're looking at is we're looking at the different parts of the brain. And so the first part, and so the information comes in here, and then underneath where my thumb's hiding, that's really my emotions. And so, this is my anger, my fear, my happiness, my joy. we have our cortex, and the cortex is the highest part of the brain. And this is really where our logic and reasoning is. So this really tells us when processing information appropriately is that they flip their lid. And so what ends up happening is that as information comes in through the brainstem, it targets our emotional center, and then we have emotional responses. As adults, we can relate to this as we think about when we might get angry or upset with somebody and we say things and it just really doesn't make any sense, right? We're talking from an emotional place. And so one of the things that we just want to think about is that our kiddos, when they're responding after they've had a situation where they haven't been able to handle the type of sensory stimulation that's coming in, they're really coming from that emotional place, and us talking them through it in that moment oftentimes doesn't work because they're not really at a place where they have that connection to the logic and reasoning because of flipping the lid. And so that's why the intervention really comes into place in terms of what are we able to do to help those students to be able to close their lid again. Okay, and I'm going to reshare, so bear with me for a second. Oh, and it started from the beginning. Okay, let's go to where we were. Just there. Okay. One of the things, though, that we want to be able to look at is that we want to be able to change, right? We want the brain to change. We want to improve the way that we're able to process information. And the great thing is that there's this concept of neuroplasticity, which means that the brain has the potential to change at any age. The change that we have is really dependent on our individual experiences. So the experiences that we create for our students who have sensory processing difficulties is really the way that we're able to change the way that they respond. And when you look at sensory diets, which we're going to get into, the theory behind that is that if you respond in a certain way, that over time, students are going to be able to change the way that they respond to the sensory input. And that over time, they won't need the sensory input given as often, as intensely, or as frequently. So we're going to talk about sensory diets. Okay. And by the way, I feel like this word has really gotten thrown around a lot. And I try to say this as nicely as I can, but I don't, OTs aren't all created equal when we talk about sensory. In terms of what we learn in school, it's a lot of variability in terms of our educational programs and how much access we have to sensory information and, building sensory diets, before we become therapists in school. So just something to think about as, we think about the therapists in our programs that, especially for some of our newer grads, it is still a big learning curve, and what they do beyond their education really does help them in terms of their understanding of these concepts, because they are difficult concepts that we're talking about when we talk about sensory processing. So our body on a regular basis is constantly striving to reach a sense of balance or be in a state of what we call homeostasis, where everything is feeling okay. I'm calm, but I'm alert and paying attention, that optimum state of arousal. So I'm really, able to sit up and I can be attentive and pay attention, but I'm also calm and in a good place and I don't have to be fidgeting. So the principles of a sensory diet arrive calming aspects in order to dampen the effects of some of the systems that are over responsive. So a sensory diet is essentially an intervention plan to provide sensory-based strategies throughout the day. And so whether you call it a sensory diet, a sensory plan, a sensory program, they're really a list of activities that the student is going to engage in throughout the day with the goal being that we're going to be getting to that calm, alert state in order to improve the student's ability to learn, socialize, and participate. We really have to target the individual's unique sensory needs. One activity for one student can have a completely opposite effect on another student's sensory system and how they respond to that. So we really have to be careful, and we have to carefully consider the type of activities that we're recommending when we recommend sensory activities. The questionnaires that I mentioned before, like the sensory profile and the sensory processing measure, they give us a good indication about what is the primary sensory system that a student is having difficulty with. And then also looking at integration based off of the information that we have in terms of the most recent evidence-based practice, is that you have to have a variety of inputs. So if a sensory diet only consists of giving a student tactile input, we're really not, accessing all of those different sensory systems the way that we want to. We need to have those other systems that are, either complementary or help to kind of dampen, again, the effects of those over-responsive systems. And that is generally proprioception, which is that deep pressure. But it can also be vestibular, because our vestibular system, which is our movement system, really helps to integrate all of the systems. It has a strong connection between every other system. So visual and our vestibular system are very closely related, vestibular and proprioception, vestibular and tactile. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of that nutritional metaphor is I always, also explain, if I eat one really good meal a week, I'm really not going to be seeing a change in either like my weight or my health. In order for me to truly make a change, I need to eat healthy every meal, every day, over a period of time. And that's really when I start to see the change. And that's the same thing with a sensory diet. I think back in the, old school OT was, the 30 minutes and that was it, of direct service. But we know that that's not going to be enough when we talk about sensory, which is why it's so important that we have the sensory diet as really that consultation piece, because it really does need to be implemented every day at regular times over a period of time to really determine are these activities truly working for the student? Are we getting the effects that we want to be getting? But then also we have to be adjusting those pieces on a regular basis to make sure that the student isn't habituating or becoming used to the input, and then it really doesn't have the same impact as it maybe once did. So definitely a lot of things to consider when you're looking at the sensory diet. And a sensory diet is really to allow an individual to reach the optimal level of occupational performance, which is really the ultimate goal as occupational therapists. And the sensory diet isn't just something to be used in the school setting, but really something to be used no matter where the student is. So some of the considerations that we look at is the location. So is the input coming from the body or from the environment? So is the student doing wall pushes or wall sits to try to get proprioceptive input, or is the student getting squeezes from somebody else externally? We want to, look at the other terms: sensory tools, sensory programs, strategies, supports. No matter what you're calling it, all of these different sensory, terms are the ways that we support students in the school when they have difficulty with sensory processing. An important thing that we need to look at is how often does the student need to engage in the activity? So oftentimes when we're first starting a sensory diet, the frequency of how often they do it is going to be more often. And we also look at the type of input that we're giving. So for instance, if we're giving a student tactile or proprioceptive information, so we do, say like brushing or massage, or we're doing deep squeezes, that input generally lasts in our system for about 90 minutes. So oftentimes, if we have a lot of tactile and proprioception in a sensory diet, we might say that we have to start it out every 2 hours. However, if we look at an input such as vestibular, which is again our movement system, this might be jumping on a trampoline, jumping jacks, bunny hops down the hallway, frog jumps. Vestibular lasts in our system to a much longer time. It can last up to 2 days. In general, though, you're just going to have a longer effect of vestibular. So you really need to be looking at how frequently you need to be doing it. Most likely, you probably only need to be doing vestibular types of input twice a day, maybe 3 times a day to start. And then you're going to be backing off from that free trampoline for 1 minute, or are we going to have them do it for 3 minutes? Continually jumping for 3 minutes is a really long time, so those are the things that we really need to be considering and thinking about when we're putting these activities together. And then the last one that we need to look at is the intensity. So when we think about intensity, we go back to that registration, or what is the smallest level of intensity that we're able to give in order for that student's system to respond to the input. And so I don't want to be doing a really intense stimulus with a student, or intense activities, if that student is really over responsive, right? We're going to need to kind of slowly get into that system in order to work on what we need to work on without having that system kind of go over the top and then trigger a stress response. So we need to be really cognizant and aware of that. Sorry, Siri. Okay. So Dr. Jean Ayers is the occupational therapist who created the theory of sensory integration. And she started her work back in the 60s. And one of her famous quotes is that sensations are food for the brain. And so the sensory diet, again, working on that metaphor, is that our body and brain need a variety of different sensations in order to really help with development and stimulation. So engaging in certain types of textures. This could also be if a student is a picky eater, that's also related to tactile. And then oftentimes the other system that can be very over responsive is our auditory system. So again, very sensitive to sounds and sounds in the environment or from other students. And so one of the goals is to really lessen the effects of those over responsive systems. We really want to help maintain an optimal arousal level. So again, we want to be in that calm but alert place when we're learning and when we're communicating with others. We want to promote a student to be able to self-regulate. Oftentimes, when students first start down the road of working on sensory processing, we really need to do what's called co-regulation. So they really need help from others in the environment to be able to get their body regulated. They just don't have the skills to be able to, one, determine when they need an activity. So we might see that they're starting to get ramped up a little bit. And as a co-regulator, I might be able to get that student to take a break from whatever they're doing, do an activity with them that will help them to regulate, and then get them back to the activity, if it's a worksheet in the classroom or something like that. And they may need that for a period of time before they're able to really identify in themselves when they need to take those breaks, and when they can identify in themselves when they are starting to kind of, get worked up a little bit. This directly goes back to that interoceptive awareness in terms of, do I know what my body is trying to tell me? I might have a feeling in my body, but I might not really know what it is. And I think a good, example of this is I might have a feeling in my stomach. Well, does that mean I need to use the bathroom? Does that mean that I'm hungry? Does it mean that I'm full? Does it mean that I'm nervous? Does it mean that I'm excited? So I know that there's a feeling in my stomach, but can I put that to the correct meaning and then know what to do about it when I do give it a meaning. And then also promoting behavior organization. And so when we look at those students who are really having a lot of difficulty, with taking in those sensory inputs, oftentimes we see that their behavioral responses are, not what we anticipated those responses to be. And so, both behavioral specialists and occupational therapists work together to try to help the students in responding to the environmental stimuli. And then, as we talked about earlier, we really want to look at maintaining a homeostasis, or like that even keel, that balance in our system, which is always what our body is striving for. Okay, so when we talk about sensory tools, which are really the activities that we're putting into the sensory diets, they really can be broken down into three different areas. And the first one is breath. Breath is super important. It's proprioceptive in nature, because as you're doing the breathing, you're using all of the muscles in the diaphragm, in throughout the rib cage. And so, working on that proprioception as you're doing that breathing really can have a profound calming effect. When you do breathing correctly, it calms the nervous system. Research has shown that it relieves stress and anxiety. It can improve focus. And for our kiddos, that something that happens when I start to work with students on breathing is that they sound like they're going to hyperventilate. So you start saying like, okay, let's do a difficulty. Oftentimes what I'll have them do is make some animal sounds. So I might tell them that we're going to do the buzzing like a bee. So I'll have them take a nice deep breath in, and then I'll have them buzz. Or I might then have them do a lion's roar. So I might have them take a nice deep breath in, and then a nice big roar. Roar. So when you're doing those and you're really doing those types of activities, you're really forcing the breath out, or that exhalation. And that's really where we're going to get the calming from. So for those students that really are having difficulty with understanding that breathing piece, change the way that you are presenting it, to really try to get that exhalation of breath, because it's really going to lead to better calming. The next area that we look at is movement. One of the other pieces that happens when our body goes into that stress response is that our body produces the stress hormone cortisol. And over time, cortisol can build in our system. And oftentimes what happens is that our students or our children are triggered into the stress response so often that the cortisol really doesn't have ample time to be able to break down in their system. And this can oftentimes lead to difficulty with falling asleep, difficulty with staying asleep throughout the night. And then poor sleep can have an inverse effect on their behavior the next day and impact their stress. And so it kind of has this negative spiral that can start. When we do movement and we incorporate proprioception and vestibular, it really can help to metabolize or break down the cortisol. Oh my goodness. And really lead to more calming. So there is a program that we work on in occupational therapy that works on interoception and really understanding what our body's trying to tell us. And so interoceptive awareness is the term that's used. And there's a program that we use that really teaches students to do different activities that highlight what's happening in different parts of their body. And so a really quick one might be if you take your hands, and all of you can do this at home, and you want to shake them as fast as you can. Shake, 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 both hands. And then stop. And so I might talk to the students then and say like, oh, what do you feel? How do your fingers feel? Maybe they feel big. Maybe they feel puffy. Maybe you can feel the blood moving in them. Maybe they're tingly. And so we would give them a list of like some different words that they can choose from, or the students, depending on their level, happy. And so we can use the feelings that we worked on in terms of that mindfulness to bring awareness, and relate those to what's happening in our environment, and make those good connections to what's happening in our body. So I wanted to go over some activities in terms of what you could be doing at home, or things that can help some different areas. So one of the things that we look at in both occupational and physical therapy, and this is also something that taps into sensory processing under that umbrella in terms of postural control, is improving posture overall. So this is going to help us to sit still in our seat, sit up nice and tall. If we're in circle time, we don't have to be leaning on a desk or leaning on the person next to us. And so there's a couple different things that we can do. We can do a Superman hold. So if you see the little girl in the picture there, she has that nice straight legs out behind her. And if she was laying on the floor on her belly, we would be asked a high plank up on your hands with your arms straight, or down on your elbows. And then doing all kinds of animal walks, crawling, snake slithering, bear walks, crab walk, any of those different types of animal walks are all going to improve posture. If you go to the same playground all the time, you get used to the equipment there. If you're able to get around to some different playgrounds, then there's different equipment, and it has the students work their gross motor and their body in different ways. Also, different sports activities. Think about, is your student somebody who would be better with individual or group type of activities? So are you somebody who's better at like karate, being more solo in what you're doing, or maybe joining a group and doing something like soccer? And then gymnastics or dance are always great ways to get our body moving and improve gross motor overall. Stability, which allows us better fine motor skills at our hands when we have really good stability at our shoulders. Another fun one is coloring up on the wall. That really helps us because as we're holding our arm up to color, we have great stability at our shoulders. So we're building up those shoulder muscles. We're also working on the muscles on the front and the back of the upper arm, so our biceps and our triceps. And then also as we have whatever you're using, a crayon, pencil up on the wall, it's encouraging that wrist extension. So again, we're building some more of the muscles of the intrinsic muscles of the hands and the wrist that will support handwriting control. Again, looking at those different animal walks. Bear walk is when you're on hands and feet with your legs straight. You could do crawling activity. So cut it into different pieces, using cookie cutters in all different ways, pushing it flat like a pancake and then pushing the cookie cutter on, all great ways to strengthen that fine motor control and that coordination. I know right now my daughter, who is a 4th grader, is super big into making friendship bracelets. That's a great way. So whether you're lacing beads on, whether you're using the different string or you use the little loom type things, that's also a great fine motor skill. Wiki sticks I love, which is like the string with the wax on it, and using them in all different ways to write your name, to build different shapes, to trace over letters if you have a younger kiddo that you're working on some letter formations with. Legos are always great, whether they're the bigger ones or they're smaller ones. You're using both hands together, you're pushing them together, you're pulling them apart. Again, promoting lots of great fine motor control. And then finally, cutting all different material. Again, how we take in information from the environment and use it, or our visual motor control. So some of these do include a motor aspect to what we're asking them to do. And so some of these activities might be I Spy, where you're having the eyes look around and work on what we call visual tracking, or moving the eyes all around, using the muscles that surround the eyes. Drawing and coloring activities are always great activities to be working on. Puzzles of all different kinds, different beading activities promote visual skills, especially if you have them do it in a certain pattern or sequence. Catching and throwing a ball at lots of different targets. So maybe you have something up on the wall that they have to hit, or maybe you have them throw it into a trash can, or you maybe have them throw it on a certain cushion. But different games like that is always great. And having those targets at different levels, in terms of like, is there one up on the wall? Is there one sitting up on the couch? Is there one on the floor? Then focus on, filling that in, and then also working on the coloring at the same time. A-OK, which is touching your pointer and your thumb, and then having the 3 other fingers, your middle, your ring, and your pinky up in the air. And you take your pencil and you put it between that thumb and pointer finger down at the tip, and then you're going to tuck in the rest of those fingers. That's that A-OK pencil grasp, which is always a good thing to remind them when they first start to write. I will tell you that research shows that changing a pencil grasp after a student has really started writing has shown very poor results. So, we try the pencil grips, we try to encourage the pencil grasp, but it is really important to work with students as they're learning to write to really have that mature functional grasp. Again, if you have it like really small where they just have to hold it with those first 3 fingers, it's going to encourage that 3-finger grasp when they go to use a pencil. And then also just doing different things with your fingers and really just building up those different, the different strength of the finger, the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the fingers. Writing with different textures. So you can write in shaving cream. You can do it on a window, sidewalk, with paper. You might also get something bumpy to put under the paper. So as your child's writing with a crayon or chalk, it's bumpy underneath. And so they're getting more feedback of the sensory system that way. That can really help them to feel how they're holding, the writing utensil and really how they're forming those letters. If any of you are familiar with Handwriting Without Tears, they have the Where Do You Start Your Letter song, which I'm not going to sing tonight for you, unfortunately. but it really does help them to remember where they need to start many of those letters, which are starting it at the top. And then giving and stop sharing. Okay. All right. So I believe, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, that everybody can see the chat there. And I wanted to leave some time tonight to answer any questions that you might have. So if there are questions, and you're able to put it in the chat, we can do it that way. And if for some reason that isn't working, because I'm not exactly sure how this is working tonight, we'll collect a way to get your questions, and then I'll be able to answer them for you. So let me just find out really quick. No questions. Okay, no questions, and I wasn't aware. Sorry about that. But what I'm hoping is that this was helpful for you to really understand how your students are receiving services in the school setting, that it helps you to have more information as you're looking at what's appropriate or not appropriate for services in the school setting. And if you do have any questions, that you reach out and let any of our therapists know, and that we're more than happy to talk to you about any of the concerns that you have, and answer any of the questions that you might have. So we're ending a few minutes early tonight. I hope you all have a good rest of your evening. And thank you so much for having me here tonight to talk to you about what I'm very passionate about, and talk about sensory. So thank you, everybody.